The morning of September 15th started like any other wedding day in small-town Millbrook, Tennessee. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my childhood bedroom, adjusting my tie for the 100th time, my hands trembling slightly. Outside, the autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber that reminded me why Lily and I had chosen this date. "You ready, son?" My father's voice came from behind the door, warm and reassuring as it had been my entire life. "As ready as I'll ever be, Dad," I called back, though my voice cracked slightly on the words. The truth was, I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Lily Morrison, soon to be Lily Brooks, was everything I had ever dreamed of and more. We had met 3 years ago at the county fair, where she was volunteering at the church booth, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun as she laughed at something her friend was saying. When she turned and smiled at me, I knew my life had just changed forever. Our relationship hadn't been without its challenges. Lily came from one of the oldest families in Millbrook, her father owning the largest farm in the county. I, on the other hand, was the son of the local mechanic. Honest work, but not exactly what the Morrisons had envisioned for their daughter. But love has a way of breaking down barriers, and eventually even her father had come to accept me, especially after I proved I could work harder than anyone else on his farm. The drive to St. Mary's Church took only 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The small stone building had stood at the heart of our community for over a century, its steeple reaching toward the Tennessee sky like a prayer made manifest. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot, I could see guests already arriving, neighbors, friends, family members who had watched both Lily and me grow up. Inside the church, everything was perfect. Lily's mother had spent weeks arranging white roses and baby's breath along the pews, and the afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden floors. The sweet scent of flowers mixed with the familiar smell of old wood and candle wax created an atmosphere that felt both sacred and deeply personal. Father Michael Thompson stood at the altar, reviewing his notes one final time. He had been the pastor at St. Mary's for nearly 20 years, baptizing half the children in town and officiating at countless weddings and funerals. A tall, thin man in his late 50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he was beloved by everyone in Millbrook. He had counseled Lily and me through our pre-marriage sessions, and I had always appreciated his wisdom and gentle guidance. But today something seemed different about him. As I took my place at the altar alongside my best man, Robert, I noticed Father Michael's hands shaking slightly as he arranged his ceremonial items. His usually composed demeanor seemed strained, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well. "You okay, Father?" I whispered as guests continued to file in behind us. He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part sadness, part resignation. "Just nervous, I suppose," he said quietly. "Every wedding is important, but some," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind. This is your day, Thomas. Focus on that beautiful bride of yours." The organ began to play and everyone rose to their feet. My heart hammered in my chest as the sanctuary doors opened and Lily appeared on her father's arm. She was breathtaking in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, which her mother had carefully altered to fit her perfectly. The dress had been stored in tissue paper for 30 years, waiting for this moment. Her veil flowed behind her like a cloud, and when our eyes met across the length of the church, her smile was radiant enough to light up the entire building. As she walked down the aisle, I felt tears prick at my eyes. This was really happening. After 3 years of dating, 6 months of engagement, and countless dreams about our future together, we were finally here. I could picture our life unfolding: the small house we had already picked out on Maple Street, the children we hoped to have, the quiet Sunday mornings we would spend together, growing old in this town that had shaped us both. Lily reached the altar, and her father, William Morrison, placed her hand in mine with a warm smile and a nod of approval. It had taken time, but he had truly come to accept me as part of the family. Lily squeezed my hand and I could feel her excitement matching my own. Father Michael cleared his throat and addressed the congregation. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to unite Thomas James Brooks and Lillian Morrison in the sacred bonds of matrimony." His voice was steady, but I noticed his hands still trembling slightly as he held his prayer book. He continued with the traditional opening words about marriage being an honorable institution, ordained by God, and not to be entered into lightly. Everything was proceeding exactly as we had rehearsed the night before. Then, something completely unexpected happened. Father Michael paused in the middle of his opening remarks and looked directly at Lily and me. The church fell silent, and even the birds outside seemed to stop singing. When he spoke again, his voice was differente, quieter, more personal, almost pained. "I have to be honest with you both and with everyone here," he said, his words echoing in the hushed sanctuary. "I've been a pastor for 20 years and I've seen many couples stand where you're standing now. Some marriages last a lifetime, built on a foundation of genuine love and commitment. Others," he paused and I could see him swallow hard. "Others are built on infatuation, on the excitement of a moment that will fade. And I have to tell you, looking at this situation, at the circumstances surrounding this union, I don't believe this love will last." A collective gasp went up from the congregation. I felt Lily's hand tighten in mine, and I could see the shock and hurt in her eyes. Behind us, I could hear whispers starting to spread through the pews like wildfire. What was he saying? What circumstances was he talking about? My first instinct was anger. How dare he? This was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, and he was destroying it with some kind of cruel prophecy. I started to speak, to defend our love, but Father Michael held up a hand. "Please let me finish," he said, and there was something in his voice, a depth of pain that made me pause. "I say this not to hurt you, but because I care too much to stay silent. Marriage is not just about love, it's about truth, about facing reality together. And sometimes, the most loving thing someone can do is to speak a difficult truth." The church was dead silent now. Even the sound of rustling clothes had stopped. Lily was staring at Father Michael with a mixture of confusion and betrayal, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I could feel the weight of every gaze in the room on us, waiting to see what would happen next. "Father," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't understand. What are you talking about? Lily and I love each other. We've been through your counseling sessions, we've planned our future together." He nodded slowly and I could see his own eyes beginning to fill with tears. "I know you believe that, Thomas. And I know you, Lily, believe it too. But there are things, connections, that neither of you are aware of. Things that, if they came to light after your marriage, would destroy not just your relationship, but both of your families." The confusion and hurt in the room was palpable. I could hear Lily's mother crying softly in the front row, and I saw Mr. Morrison half rise from his seat, his face red with anger. This was supposed to be a celebration, and instead it felt like a funeral. "What connections?" Lily spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the silent church. "Father Michael, we've known each other our whole lives. We've lived in the same town, gone to the same school. What could you possibly know that we don't?" Father Michael closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, tears were streaming down his cheeks. The sight of this man, who had always been such a pillar of strength and composure, breaking down in front of all of us, was almost more shocking than his words had been. "Because," he said, his voice breaking, 24 years ago, I made a promise to someone I loved very much. A promise to keep a secret that I thought would protect everyone involved. But standing here now, watching you two prepare to make vows to each other, I realized that my silence might cause more harm than my secret ever could." The church erupted in whispers and confused murmurs. I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare, where the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of my new life was instead revealing cracks in everything I thought I knew about my world. "Please," Lily said, and her voice was stronger now, though I could see her struggling to maintain her composure. "Whatever it is, just tell us. We deserve to know." Father Michael nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "You do deserve to know. And I should have told you both long ago, but I was a coward. I chose what seemed like the easier path, and now," he looked around at the assembled congregation, at the faces of people who had trusted him with their deepest secrets and most important moments. "Now I have to choose between breaking a 24-year-old promise and watching two young people I care about deeply make a mistake that will haunt them forever." The silence that followed felt eternal. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel Lily trembling beside me. Whatever Father Michael was about to reveal, I knew it would change everything. The question was, would it destroy us or would it somehow, impossibly, make us stronger? Father Michael stepped down from the altar, moving closer to where Lily and I stood frozen in our wedding attire. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass seemed to dim, as if the very building was holding its breath along with its congregation. "Thomas, Lily," he said softly, "what I'm about to tell you should have been shared years ago. It involves both of your families and a decision that was made before either of you were born." I could hear shuffling behind us as people leaned forward, straining to hear every word. The church that had felt so warm and welcoming just minutes earlier now felt suffocating, the walls seeming to press in around us. 25 years ago, Father Michael began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "your parents were all much younger. The town was smaller then, more isolated. People knew each other's business, but they also knew how to keep secrets when it mattered. He paused, looking directly at me. Thomas, your father wasn't always a mechanic. Before you were born, James Brooks worked at Morrison Farm. He was William Morrison's business partner, in fact. They had big plans. They were going to expand the operation, maybe even franchise it to other counties. This was news to me. Dad had always told me he'd been a mechanic his whole adult life, that he'd learned the trade from his own father. I glanced back toward where he sat in the third row, and I could see the color had drained from his face. And your mother, Father Michael continued, now looking at Lily, Margaret Morrison, wasn't always a Morrison. What do you mean? Lily asked, her voice barely audible. I mean, she was born Margaret Collins and she worked as a secretary at the county courthouse. She was engaged to someone else when she met your father. Father Michael's hands were shaking more violently now. She was engaged to James Brooks. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak, and if not for Lily's grip on my hand, I might have fallen. Behind us, the congregation erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. That's impossible, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could feel the truth of it settling in my chest like a stone. Suddenly, so many things made sense: the way my father had always been uncomfortable around the Morrisons, the way he'd discouraged me from dating Lily initially, the strange tension I'd sometimes felt during family gatherings. It's not impossible, Father Michael said gently. It's what happened. James and Margaret were planning their own wedding, right here in this church in the spring of 1985. But William Morrison had returned from agricultural college, and when he saw Margaret, he shook his head. Love is complicated, and the heart doesn't always choose what makes sense. I looked at Lily, seeing my own shock and confusion mirrored in her face. The woman who was supposed to be my mother-in-law in a matter of minutes had once been engaged to my father. It was like discovering that our entire lives had been built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. What happened to the engagement? Lily asked, though I could tell from her tone that she was afraid to hear the answer. Margaret broke it off 6 weeks before their wedding. The invitations had been sent, the church was booked, the reception hall was paid for. Father Michael's voice grew softer. James was devastated. But he was also a good man, and he could see that Margaret's heart had chosen someone else. He stepped aside. And then what? I demanded, anger starting to burn through the shock. Dad just pretended it never happened? Mom pretended she'd never loved someone else. It wasn't that simple, Thomas. Father Michael looked around the church at the faces of people who had lived through this drama, who had kept this secret for decades. Small towns are complicated places. Everyone knew what had happened, but they also understood that life had to go on. James eventually met your mother, Catherine, when she moved to town 2 years later. Margaret and William got married and started their family. On the surface, everything worked out. On the surface, I repeated bitterly. But the truth has a way of creating ripples even when it's buried, Father Michael continued. James never completely got over Margaret. And Margaret, despite her love for William, never completely forgave herself for the pain she caused James. It created a tension that has existed between your families for 24 years. I thought about all the times my father had found excuses not to attend community events where the Morrisons would be present. All the times he'd been polite but distant when I'd brought Lily home for dinner. I'd attributed it to class differences, to his feeling out of place around the town's most successful farming family. Now I understood it was something much deeper. This is why you don't think our love will last? Lily asked, and I could hear the pain in her voice. Because our parents had a complicated history? Father Michael shook his head. No, my dear. That's not why. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was so quiet that even in the dead silence of the church, I had to strain to hear him. It's because of what happened after the breakup and what it might mean for both of you. Another wave of dread washed over me. Whatever revelation was coming, I could sense it would be even more devastating than what we'd already learned. After Margaret broke their engagement, James was heartbroken. He left town for several months, went to stay with relatives in Kentucky while he tried to figure out what to do with his life. But before he left, Father Michael stopped, and I could see him gathering courage for what came next. Before he left, he and Margaret had one final conversation. It was late at night, behind the church, and they both said things they probably shouldn't have. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I felt Lily stiffen beside me. Are you saying, she began but couldn't finish the sentence. I'm saying that when James left town, Margaret was already 3 weeks pregnant. And when William Morrison married her 6 weeks later, he believed the child was his. The church exploded in shocked exclamations and cries of disbelief. I heard someone, I think it was Lily's aunt, let out a small scream. Behind me, I could hear rapid footsteps as someone rushed out of the sanctuary. But all I could focus on was Lily's face, watching as the full implications of Father Michael's words sank in. We stared at each other in horror, the same terrible thought occurring to both of us at the same moment. "No," Lily whispered. "No, that's not possible." "I'm afraid it might be," Father Michael said gently. Margaret gave birth to her first child exactly 9 months and 1 week after that conversation with James. A beautiful baby girl who looked exactly like her mother, which made it easy for everyone to assume she took after the Morrison side of the family. The world seemed to tilt around me. Lily was 24 years old. The timing was perfect or perfectly horrible depending on how you looked at it. But that would mean I started, then stopped, unable to voice the unthinkable. It would mean that there's a very real possibility that your brother and sister, Father Michael finished for me, his voice heavy with sorrow. And that's why I can't, in good conscience, perform this ceremony until we know for certain. The church was in chaos now. I could hear crying, arguments breaking out between family members, chairs scraping as people stood up or collapsed into their seats. But in the middle of all that noise and confusion, there was a strange bubble of silence around Lily and me, as if we were existing in a separate reality where the only thing that mattered was the terrible possibility hanging between us. "This is insane," Lily said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My father is William Morrison. I have his eyes, his stubborn streak, his love of farming. All of which could also come from James Brooks," Father Michael said sadly. "Physical traits, personality characteristics, they're not proof of paternity. The only way to know for sure is genetic testing." I looked out at the congregation and spotted my father in the third row. He was sitting with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Near the front, William Morrison was standing, his face a mask of fury and pain, while Margaret Morrison, Lily's mother, possibly my half-sister's mother, sat motionless, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How long have you known?" I asked Father Michael. "I've suspected for years," he admitted. The timing, the way James has always looked at Lily with such complicated emotions, the way Margaret has always seemed guilty around your family. But I kept hoping I was wrong, that it was just my imagination influenced by knowing the history. "And you never said anything?" Lily's voice was sharp with accusation. What was I supposed to say? Break up a family based on suspicion? Destroy William Morrison with doubt about his daughter's paternity? Cause pain for everyone involved based on something that might not even be true? Father Michael spread his hands helplessly. I convinced myself that if it were true, it would come out naturally, that somehow the truth would reveal itself before any real harm was done. "Real harm," I repeated. "Like us falling in love? Like you getting married and possibly having children together without knowing," he said gently. "Thomas, Lily, I've watched you two together for 3 years. Your love is real and beautiful and pure. But if you are siblings, then your relationship, no matter how innocent it began, becomes something else entirely." The full weight of the situation crashed down on me then. Not only might Lily be my half-sister, but we had been romantically involved for 3 years. We had kissed, held hands, talked about having children together, shared dreams about our future. The thought made me physically ill. "I need to sit down," Lily said weakly, and Robert, my best man, quickly brought a chair from the front row. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Now," Father Michael said, "we find out the truth. It will require paternity testing, comparing William Morrison's DNA, James Brooks' DNA, and Lily's DNA. It's not a difficult process, but it will take a few days to get results. And until then? Until then you wait. And pray. And prepare yourselves for whatever the truth might be." I looked around the church at the faces of people I'd known my entire life. Some looked shocked, some looked sympathetic, some looked like they were hungry for gossip. All of them looked like they were witnessing the destruction of everything Lily and I had built together. "I want to go home," Lily said quietly. I nodded, understanding completely. This beautiful church that was supposed to witness our union had instead become the site of the most devastating revelation of our lives. The wedding dress that was supposed to represent the beginning of our new life together now felt like a costume in a play that had taken a horrific turn. "We'll figure this out," I told her, though I had no idea how. "Will we?" she asked, and the doubt in her voice cut through me like a knife. As we prepared to leave the church, Father Michael called out to us one more time. "Thomas, Lily," he said, "I know this seems like the end of everything right now. But sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, is the only path to real peace. Whatever these tests reveal, You'll face it with courage because that's who you both are. But as we walked down the aisle that I had imagined we would walk down as husband and wife, all I could think about was how sometimes the truth doesn't set you free, sometimes it just destroys everything you thought you knew about your life. The doors of St. Mary's Church closed behind us, and I couldn't help wondering if they would ever feel like home again. The 3 days following our crashed wedding felt like 3 years. Lily and I existed in a strange limbo, too afraid to be together but too connected to stay completely apart. We had decided, after much painful discussion, that we couldn't continue any physical contact, not even holding hands, until we knew the truth. The possibility that we might be siblings made even the most innocent touch feel wrong. I spent most of those days at my father's auto shop, throwing myself into work with an intensity that worried everyone around me. The physical labor of fixing engines and replacing brake pads was the only thing that seemed to quiet the chaos in my mind. But every few hours, the reality would crash over me again like a cold wave. The woman I loved might be my half-sister. Dad and I hadn't talked much since the revelation at the church. He'd submitted to the paternity test without complaint, a simple cheek swab that took less than a minute but felt like signing away our entire family's future. The guilt in his eyes was almost unbearable to look at. 24 years of keeping this secret had aged him in ways I was only now beginning to understand. On Tuesday evening, as I was closing up the shop, he finally approached me. I was washing grease off my hands at the industrial sink when I heard his footsteps behind me. "Son," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I dried my hands slowly, dreading the conversation but knowing it was inevitable. "What's there to talk about, Dad? Either you're Lily's father or you're not. Either I've been in love with my sister for 3 years or I haven't." "There's more to it than that," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "There's things you need to understand about what happened back then." We sat on 2 overturned crates in the corner of the shop, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal. Dad stared at his hands for a long moment before he began to speak. "I loved Margaret Collins more than I thought it was possible to love another human being," he said. "When she chose William over me, it felt like my entire world had collapsed. But I accepted it because I could see she was happy with him, and her happiness mattered more to me than my own pain." "But you slept with her after she'd made her choice?" I said, unable to keep the accusation out of my voice. He flinched as if I'd hit him. "It wasn't like that, Thomas. It wasn't some sordid affair or revenge or anything calculated. She came to me the night before I was supposed to leave town. She was crying, saying she was sorry, saying she'd made a terrible mistake, but it was too late to change anything." Dad paused, lost in the memory. "We were both hurting so much, and for one night, we comforted each other. It was wrong, I knew it was wrong even as it was happening. But it also felt like goodbye, like the final chapter of something beautiful that could never be." "And you never suspected that Lily might be yours?" "I wondered," he admitted. "Especially as she got older and I started seeing little things, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she laughed at her own jokes, little gestures that reminded me of my own family. But Margaret had married William, and Lily was their daughter. What right did I have to disrupt that? I thought about Lily's laugh, which I'd always found infectious. Now I wondered if I'd been drawn to it because it reminded me, on some subconscious level, of my father's laugh." "Did Mom ever know?" I asked. "Your mother knew about my engagement to Margaret, of course. But she never knew about that last night. And I pray she never has to find out." His voice broke slightly. "Catherine doesn't deserve to have her marriage questioned because of a mistake I made before I even met her." The next morning, I drove past the Morrison farm on my way to nowhere in particular. It was a route I'd taken hundreds of times over the past 3 years, usually with excitement about seeing Lily. Now the familiar red barn and white farmhouse looked different, foreign. I could see Lily's car in the driveway and I had to fight the urge to stop. We'd agreed to give each other space until the results came in, but the separation was killing me. I knew she was struggling too. Her best friend, Jessica, had called me the day before to check on both of us. According to her, Lily hadn't left her room since Monday, barely eating and refusing to talk to anyone about what had happened. "She's convinced you two are siblings," Jessica had told me. "She keeps saying she should have known, that she should have seen the signs." "What signs?" I'd asked. "I don't know, Thomas. She's not making much sense right now. She mentioned something about how comfortable you two always were together, how easy everything felt from the beginning. She thinks maybe it felt natural because you were family." The thought haunted me. Our relationship had been unusually easy from the start. We'd never had the awkward getting-to-know-you phase that most couples experienced. We'd fit together like puzzle pieces, finishing each other's sentences, sharing the same sense of humor, having an almost telepathic understanding of each other's moods. At the time, I thought it was proof that we were soulmates. Now, it felt like potential evidence of something much more disturbing. On Wednesday, I ran into William Morrison at the hardware store. He was buying fence repair materials, and when he saw me, his entire body went rigid. For a moment, I thought he might turn around and leave without speaking. Instead, he approached me, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "Thomas?" he said with a stiff nod. "Mr. Morrison." We stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the mundane normalcy of hammers and nails and paintbrushes, while our family's lives hung in the balance. "How is she?" I asked finally, unable to help myself. His jaw tightened. "She's heartbroken. This whole situation has shattered her world." "Mine too," I said quietly. He studied my face for a long moment, and some of the hardness in his expression softened slightly. "You really love her, don't you?" "More than my own life," I answered honestly. "That's what makes this so damn tragic," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If the tests come back positive, if James is her biological father, it doesn't change the fact that she's my daughter in every way that matters. I raised her, I taught her to ride a bike, I walked the floor with her when she had nightmares. But it also doesn't change the fact that you two can't be together." The finality in his voice hit me like a physical blow. "And if the tests come back negative?" He was quiet for a long time, considering. "Then we'll all have to figure out how to move forward, knowing what we know about the past. Your father and my wife will have to face what happened between them. You and Lily will have to decide if you can build a marriage on a foundation that's been cracked by these revelations." "Do you think we can?" I asked, genuinely wanting his opinion. "I think love can overcome a lot of things," he said slowly. "But I also think some secrets leave scars that never fully heal. You'll have to decide for yourselves whether the love you share is stronger than the pain of knowing how complicated your family's histories are." That evening, I sat on my front porch watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. It should have been a perfect evening, the kind Lily and I used to spend planning our future together. Instead, I was alone, trying to imagine what that future might look like under either scenario. If the tests proved Lily was my half-sister, our relationship would have to end immediately and completely. We could never be alone together again, never touch, never even be close friends without people wondering and gossiping. The love that had been the center of my world for 3 years would become something shameful that we'd have to spend the rest of our lives trying to forget. If the tests proved we weren't related, we'd have to somehow rebuild our relationship while dealing with the knowledge that our parents shared this complicated history. Every family gathering would be tainted by the unspoken truth. Every time we looked at Margaret Morrison, we'd remember that she'd once been engaged to my father, that there had been a night when she'd chosen him over her husband, even if only temporarily. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped when I saw Lily's name on the screen. "Can't sleep. Thinking about everything. This waiting is torture." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I know. I keep wondering if we'll be able to get through this no matter what the results say." "What do you mean?" "Even if we're not related, how do we go back to the way things were? How do we pretend we don't know what we know?" There was a long pause before her next message came through. "Maybe we can't go back. Maybe we have to find a way forward instead." "What does forward look like?" "I don't know. I guess we'll find out tomorrow when the results come in." Tomorrow. After 3 days that felt like an eternity, the answer was finally coming. Dr. Harrison at the County Medical Center had called that afternoon to confirm that the paternity test results would be ready by noon on Thursday. 24 years of secrets would finally be revealed, and our lives would be forever changed by whatever truth those results contained. I spent that last night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare myself for either outcome. But how do you prepare for the possibility that your entire life has been built on a lie? How do you ready yourself to discover that the person you love most in the world is forbidden to you by the most fundamental laws of nature and society? As dawn broke on Thursday morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized that no amount of preparation could make this easier. All I could do was face whatever truth was waiting for me with as much courage as I could muster, and hope that somehow, some way, love would find a path through the wreckage of our shattered certainty. The longest week of my life was about to end. But I had no idea if what came next would be salvation or devastation. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself was reflecting the somber mood that had settled over Millbrook. I arrived at Dr. Harrison's office 15 minutes early, my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. The waiting room felt suffocating, with its sterile white walls and magazine selection that seemed absurdly cheerful given the circumstances. Lily was already there when I walked in, sitting in the corner chair with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, dark circles under her eyes, her normally perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans and an old sweater instead of her usual carefully coordinated outfits. When she looked up and saw me, she attempted a smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Hey," I said softly, taking the chair across from her but leaving an empty seat between us. "Hey," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't touch, didn't even move closer together, but just being in the same room felt like both a comfort and a torment. 3 days of separation had felt like 3 years, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to take her hand, to hold her, to promise that everything would be okay. But I couldn't make that promise and I couldn't risk the contact. The door to the back offices opened, and both our fathers emerged, followed by Margaret Morrison. The tension between the three of them was thick enough to cut with a knife. James Brooks, my father, looked like he'd aged a decade since Sunday. William Morrison's jaw was set in a hard line, his farmer's hands clenched into fists at his sides. And Margaret looked broken, her usually composed demeanor completely shattered. "The whole family's here," Dr. Harrison said as he appeared in the doorway, holding a manila envelope that contained our fate. "Why don't we all go into the conference room where we'll have more privacy?" The conference room was small and windowless, with a round table surrounded by 6 chairs. We arranged ourselves awkwardly, Lily and I on one side, our parents distributed around the remaining seats like they were trying to maintain maximum distance from each other. Dr. Harrison sat at the head of the table, the envelope unopened in front of him. "Before I share these results," he said, his voice professionally calm, "I want to remind everyone that whatever we learn here today, you're all good people who found yourselves in an extraordinary situation. There's no blame to be assigned here, only truth to be faced." He opened the envelope slowly and I found myself holding my breath. Beside me, I could hear Lily's rapid, shallow breathing. The paternity test comparing William Morrison's DNA with Lily Morrison's DNA shows a 99.97% probability that William Morrison is Lily's biological father, Dr. Harrison read from the report. For a moment, the words didn't register. Then, like a dam breaking, relief flooded through me so powerfully that I thought I might faint. Lily let out a sob that was part crying, part laughter, and without thinking, I reached for her hand. She squeezed it so tightly that it hurt, but I didn't care. "We're not siblings," she whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. "You're not siblings," Dr. Harrison confirmed with a gentle smile. "William Morrison is definitely Lily's biological father." I looked across the table at our parents, expecting to see relief matching our own. Instead, I saw something much more complicated. William Morrison had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Margaret was crying openly, but they weren't tears of relief, they were tears of what looked like profound grief. And my father was staring at the table with an expression of such deep sadness that it broke my heart. "Dad," I said tentatively. He looked up at me and I saw tears in his eyes. "I'm happy for you, son. I truly am. You and Lily can have the life you dreamed of. But for 24 years I've wondered if I had a daughter out there. If maybe some small part of Margaret lived on in this world through a child we'd created together." His voice broke. "It was wrong of me to wonder, wrong of me to hope, but I did. And now you know for certain that you don't," Margaret finished for him, her voice thick with emotion. "And I know for certain that my moment of weakness, my goodbye with you, was just that, a goodbye. It didn't create anything lasting except guilt that I've carried for over 2 decades. The complexity of the emotions in the room was overwhelming. Lily and I were experiencing the euphoria of learning we could be together, while our parents were grappling with the definitive end of a chapter they'd left unfinished 24 years ago. "I owe you all an apology," Margaret said, addressing the room but looking primarily at her husband. "William, you married me knowing I'd been engaged to someone else, but you didn't know about that last night. I should have told you years ago." William Morrison finally looked up from his hands. "Would it have changed anything? Would telling me have made our marriage stronger?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But living with the secret, wondering if the man I'd chosen was raising another man's child, carrying that guilt every time I looked at Lily, it changed me. It made me more distant, more careful with my emotions. I think maybe it hurt our marriage in ways I didn't even realize. And I've spent 24 years wondering if I was a father who abandoned his child," my dad added quietly. "Every time I saw Lily, especially as she got older, I wondered if I was looking at my daughter. It made me keep my distance from your family, William, which I know affected Thomas's relationship with Lily. I thought about all the times Dad had seemed uncomfortable around the Morrisons, all the family gatherings he'd found excuses to miss, all the times he'd been polite but distant when Lily came to dinner. Now I understood, he'd been protecting himself from the pain of possibly seeing his biological daughter living with another family. So where does this leave us? Lily asked, her voice stronger now that the initial shock was wearing off. It leaves you free to love each other, Dr. Harrison said simply. Biologically, legally, morally there's no impediment to your relationship. But what about everything else? I asked. What about the history between our families? What about the secrets and the pain and the years of wondering? That's something you'll all have to work through together, Dr. Harrison replied. But those are emotional challenges, not genetic ones. They're the kind of problems that families face and overcome every day. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each of us processing what we'd learned. Finally, Lily stood up. I need some air, she said. Thomas, will you walk with me? I nodded and followed her out of the medical building and into the parking lot. The drizzle had stopped and weak sunlight was trying to break through the clouds. We can get married, she said as if testing how the words sounded. We can get married, I agreed. But can we be happy? Really happy knowing what we know? It was the question I'd been afraid to ask myself. I think we can try. Our parents made their choices 24 years ago, and they've lived with the consequences. But their story doesn't have to be our story. She turned to face me, and for the first time in days, she looked like the Lily I'd fallen in love with, strong, determined, beautiful. I love you, Thomas Brooks. I've loved you for 3 years, and I'm going to love you for the rest of my life, regardless of what complications our families bring to the table. I love you too, I said, and finally, I was able to pull her into my arms and hold her the way I'd been desperate to hold her for days. We stood there in the parking lot, holding each other and crying tears of relief, tears of joy, tears of exhaustion from the emotional roller coaster we'd been on. When we finally pulled apart, Lily was smiling. So, she said, should we go back in there and tell them we want to reschedule the wedding? I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had since Sunday. Are you sure? After everything that's happened, after all the drama and secrets and complications. I'm sure, she said firmly. But I want to do it differently this time. I want our wedding to be about truth, not secrets. I want both our fathers to walk me down the aisle, James because he's been like a second father to me all these years, and William because he's the man who raised me and shaped who I am. And Father Michael? I want Father Michael to officiate. He was brave enough to stop us from making what could have been a terrible mistake, and honest enough to reveal a truth that needed to come out. If he can find the courage to speak painful truths, maybe we can find the courage to build our marriage on complete honesty. We walked back into the medical building hand in hand, and I felt like everything was possible again. Yes, our families had a complicated history. Yes, there would be awkward moments and difficult conversations ahead. Yes, we'd have to work through trust issues and rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of secrets. But we weren't siblings. We were free to love each other, free to build a life together, free to create our own family story that would be different from our parents' story. When we walked back into the conference room, our parents looked up expectantly. We want to reschedule the wedding, Lily announced. 2 weeks from Saturday, same church, same time. But we want to do it right this time, no secrets, no wondering, no unfinished business hanging over us. Margaret Morrison stood up and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, she smiled. I think that sounds perfect. And I want to make something clear, William Morrison said, his voice strong and sure. Thomas, you have my complete blessing to marry my daughter. You've loved her honorably and faithfully, and you've both handled this impossible situation with more grace than I would have thought possible. My father nodded in agreement. You two have shown me what real love looks like, love that survives even when the foundation it's built on gets shaken. I'm proud of both of you. As we left the medical building that day, I realized that Father Michael had been both right and wrong in his assessment. He'd been right that some loves don't last when they're tested by truth and difficulty. But he'd been wrong about ours. Our love wasn't weakened by the truth, it was strengthened by it. We'd faced the worst possible scenario and chosen each other anyway. 2 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, I stood at the altar of St. Mary's Church again. This time, when Father Michael asked if anyone had any reason why Lily and I shouldn't be wed, the silence that followed was peaceful rather than tense. When he pronounced us husband and wife, there wasn't a dry eye in the congregation, including his own. But these tears were different from the ones he'd shed 2 weeks earlier. These were tears of joy, tears of redemption, tears of a community coming together to celebrate love that had been tested and proven true. And when Lily and I kissed as husband and wife for the first time, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, with truth as our foundation and love as our strength. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that almost didn't happen at all.